over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ajay. Thank you. So the recording has started, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So today what we'll be talking about is OAuth in MuleSoft connectors. Um, Now, there's a lot of things regarding OAuth that we, especially as backend developers or middleware developers, that we should know and we should be aware about. Uh, and recently, the connectors that has been published by MuleSoft in the last 6 months or 1 year time frame uses OAuth extensively, and that's internal to the connector as well. So earlier we used to have schedulers and different other mechanisms to maintain our tokens, to retain our tokens. Um, but nowadays, most of the connectors that has come out, they support OAuth natively, I'd say, and that's what we'll be going through. And before that, I'll be covering some OAuth basics as well. So if you have not worked with OAuth, or if you have just heard about OAuth somewhere in some PPT, in some connector, in some documentation, so I'll be going through that as well. Some very basics of OAuth. Why do we need it? How it came into practice, and any advantage or disadvantage. And then we'll go through the one demo of how we can configure it. Now it's applicable for an in number of connectors, I'd say. But of course, in interest of time, we cannot show all of those. So I'll be configuring one of those connectors. And also, in case there is no connector available for your particular use case or your particular end system, so how do you do that with a regular HTTP request connector as well? So I'll be going through both of those. But we'll just keep in mind that the concept remains same for all of these connectors and for anything that implements OAuth. So OAuth is a standard protocol. So whichever service implements that, the concept at its core is still the same. So that's the agenda of this meetup. So I'll start with our own topics. So before we deep dive into the OAuth grant types and everything, so I'll just quickly brief you on what is OAuth and why it came into picture. So in initial days, right, in 1990s or in 2000, early 2007, I would say, till the time when the iPhone came out and the whole web boom happened. So before that, authentication or authorization was very simple. It's like if you have a website, and if you have a game or a service that you provide, you just take in a user's email ID and a password, and that's all what you need to authenticate a user or to do anything with them, right? Now, as time went along, and we had massive giants like Google, like Facebook, and everyone was like, okay, do I need to create an account individually for every website I visit, right? And that become a cumbersome task. So in order to change that, and also to do service to service communication, right, that was not present in earlier days, that's where this whole concept of authorization using third party services and all came into picture. Now, in initial days, how it started, let's take an example problem that, okay, maybe there's a service you are using, and you want to invite your friends to that service, to that game, right? Now, that particular game needs an access to your contacts, right? Now, how do you give your contacts access to that particular service? You don't want that service to access anything else. You don't want it to access your Google Drive files. You don't want them to access your location. You just want to give access only to your contacts. That was one of the first problems that the industry identified before OAuth came into picture. So initially, there was a development by Yelp, a very popular service in the United States. So how Yelp configured it is, you give Yelp your own Gmail username and password, and they tell you, okay, I'm taking your username, your password, and I promise you I'm not accessing anything else. I'll just take your contacts, right? Now, given that you have blind trust in Yelp and Gmail as well, that Yelp is not going to misuse your data, you can probably do that, but in most cases, right, no one will ever be comfortable to hand over their Gmail username and passwords to anyone, right? No matter what level of security you have in your data laws. So that's where came the discussion of OAuth. So where you give a third-party service temporary or restricted access to something that you hold. For example, your contacts. You want to give that access to only your service that you trust and nothing else. That's where all this OAuth interaction started. Now, OAuth is basically a standard, and any and every other service that implements OAuth has its own way of doing things. They can have their custom protocols, they can have their custom attributes, they can have their custom headers, whatever it is that they need, given that they are following a certain amount of protocols. So any any OAuth service that you see out there on the internet will probably have some of the things that's different from the other service that you have already worked with. So how Auth works, I'll go into that details of it. So first of all, what we need to understand is web now is very distributed. So you can have authentication needs for your website. It can be for your native mobile apps. It can be for complete backend servers. So there are different needs. That's why OAuth has adapted to something called as grant types. So based on where you are using OAuth or where you are implementing OAuth, these are some logical differentiations between those. Now, which one you need to choose depends on two factors. One, what is that your end system supports, or the authorization server that you are using that supports it. That's one. And the second thing is where you are implementing it. Are you developing a website? Are you developing an Android app? Are you developing an iOS app? Or you are doing something as a single page JavaScript application? Depending on your use case, you need to decide which kind of grant type suits your use case best. Now what are the kinds of different grant types we have? So we have authorization code, we have PKCE, or widely known as PIXE, we have client credentials, we have device code, we have refresh token, and these are the modern scopes that are typically used nowadays. And now there are some legacy scopes as well, which includes implicit and password grant, and you should always try to avoid using these two. And these are not very, at least implicit or PIXE or device code, these are not very relevant for our whole MuleSoft world. The reason being they are very browser or native mobile app focused. What is relevant for us is auth code, client credentials, refresh token, password grant, these kind of types. And we'll go through all what they do, how they do it, and which example use case you would use which one. Okay, so now these are these are not definitions. These are just quick hacks or things that you need to keep in mind when you are configuring any kind of OAuth service. One, so authorization code. Now, an authorization code is not a token. It's not an access token. You cannot access any resource with a code. It's an open thing. If you have ever configured OAuth, you'll see that the authorization code is visible in your browser URL. Now, if anything is in your browser URL, that's not secured at all. You cannot do anything with that. That should not work as a token. So again, auth code is not a token. If you have retrieved auth code, you need to do some additional steps to get a token. Now, why is that and how is that happens? I'll come to that in the following slides. Now, where do you get an auth code? Once you have an auth setup, you get this auth code back in your redirect URL. Now, when I initially started with implementing OAuth service, my initial development was with Google Calendar APIs, and there wasn't any kind of this Google specific connectors back then. It was back in 2020. So I was very confused on okay, it needs a callback URL. Now, what is a callback URL? Right? I need to implement it in Anypoint Studio. What do I do with it? So a callback URL, in simple terms, is a listener. So whenever you want to configure a callback URL, That's as simple as a listener. In that listener, there will that particular listener will not be invoked by you. It won't be invoked by your API consumer. It will be invoked by the OAuth server. Assuming you are using Google's OAuth server, this listener will be triggered by Google. And in that particular listener, you will get a query param called as code or auth code, depending on the implementation. It usually typically is code. So you will get a query parameter called code, and that's where you get your authorization code. So you can access that using attributes.queryparams.code. It's as simple as that. Now we'll be going through the complete flows and demos with authorization code as well. Now, one key thing to keep in mind is an auth code is usually valid for only once. Once you have used that, it probably won't work the next time. So when you're not starting your development, you'll probably do a lot of ping pongs. You'll try a lot of things. Maybe it fails sometime, maybe it succeeds sometime. So try to use a new auth code every time you are trying that. There's very possible a valid auth code. In case you fail to retrieve an access token with that auth code, it still becomes invalid. So get a new auth code every time is what I'm trying to say. And
hey Anna, sorry to interrupt you. There is a question here. So OAuth grant types are same for both OAuth 1.0 and 2.0.
Okay, so coming to OAuth 1 and 2. So OAuth 1 is what initially OAuth started with. That's not used now at all. So whenever I say OAuth in this particular slide or on any slide, it typically means OAuth 2.0. Thanks for notifying it. I forgot to mention that point. So OAuth 1 is not used now at all. Anything that we say OAuth is OAuth 2.0. And
another question.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. At present, what is the latest version of OAuth token? So it's 2.0, right?
Yeah, it's not OAuth tokens version, it's the OAuth protocols version. That's 2.0. There's no version for the token, it's the protocol. And if someone is confused between what do we do with OAuth, OAuth is for authorization. The auth in OAuth stands for authorization and not authentication. Those are pretty different things. Authorization and authentication. Not going into details on how they are different and what they are different, but just keep in mind it's not supposed. It's not made to identify you as a user. It doesn't care who the user is. It cares whether that user has access to a particular resource or not. So that's authorization. You don't. OAuth doesn't do authentication, but there was a need of doing authentication as well. So Google, Facebook, and everyone else tried to came with workarounds to do authentication as well using OAuth. Because okay, once you know that okay, this user has access to this, why not also add another layer and let them authenticate as well using OAuth. That's where I mean probably not part of the topic this for this particular session, but that's where OpenID Connect came into picture. OpenID Connect is nothing but OAuth plus authentication. That's what is OpenID Connect. But
Thanks.
In general, OAuth is always authorization. Yeah, sorry about this.
Yes, Anna, we can go ahead.
Okay. I see there's a question that says, can you explain once again about callback URL? We'll come to callback URL and everything in the demo and in the further slides as well. Don't worry, we'll come to each of everything. Okay. Now, the point in bold is very important to notice. It needs an UI at least once. So a lot of people who start working with OAuth try to do it from Postman or some other place. Try to do it directly using backend servers. That doesn't work. It needs an UI at least once, but it needs to render that consent dialog box. So it needs an user. It needs an UI to do that. And keeping in mind it's an UI. I'm not saying that it's a browser. You can do it inside Postman or inside a native app that can render a web page. Anything that can render a web page. Okay, and it's not completely server side. And why is that, and what you should use in server-side communications? We'll come to that as well. And the last point is it's also referred to as code or auth code or authorization code, whatever it is, they mean the same thing. Now, access token. In most cases, we use a token type called bearer. And this is what you need to supply as authorization header. So it should be under attributes.headers.authorization. And you need to pass this particular token, which is called as an access token, which uses, again, a way of encryption as JWT. And again, JWT is a whole new topic. Will not go into that details. So it's part of your authorization header for every request you make. Now, we all know that HTTP is a stateless protocol, and whatever we do or whatever we develop in Mule it's using HTTP 1.1, which is completely stateless. So anytime you want to use an access token, that means for every request, this authorization header should be present. Now, access tokens is what gives you the actual access to that particular resource, and they are not forever, right? It's not client ID secret. It's not an API key. It's not valid forever. It usually expires typically in 1 hour if you're configuring it in Okta or something like that, or even Google. They usually stay for around an hour, so 3600 seconds. But it can be as low as 10 minutes. So there's an end system called TalkDesk that I've integrated. In that case, the token was valid for 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes or before that, you need to refresh that, or you need to get a new token. Or it can be as high as, so there's a system called Resource Guru. And in that case, every access token is valid for 7 days. Nonetheless, it's always going to expire. So you need to have a refreshing strategy as well. So how do you get a new token? It's always going to expire. Some very quickly, some for 7 days or like that. But you need that automated refreshing. You need to get the token automatically, and you cannot depend that, okay, every 7 days my token expires, and every 7 days my application is down and it's waiting for someone to come and authorize again so that my application starts working again. So we don't do that. I mean, it should not do that. Now I'll be going to the next one. Okay. Now, when I say refreshing the token, right? So what is a refresh token? A refresh token is when you get an access token initially, typically you get a refresh token as well. What is a refresh token? A refresh token is a long-lived token, which is there for a long period of time. So a common myth regarding refresh token is refresh tokens never expire. That's not true for all cases. As I said, every OAuth implementation or every OAuth server, they implement it differently. In case of Google, it's usually almost, it never expires. In case of Microsoft, they usually keep it for around 2 years or so. And again, it depends on the OAuth server, how they implement it. So it cannot always be true that refresh tokens never expire. Not the case. Now, what is a refresh token? A refresh token is what gives you a new access token. So your access token that was valid for 1 hour, once that 1 hour period is done, what do, right? Do you get some user and say, okay, hey, authorize again? Like, do you want your user to authorize an app every 1 hour? No, right? That's very painful. That's a really bad user experience. So that's where the concept of refresh token came into picture. So when your token expires initially, you go back to the auth server. You don't go back to the user. You go back to the auth server and say, hey, my token has expired, and here's a refresh token that proves my identity, that the last time I was the intended receiver for the token. So you give them a refresh token, and the auth server will give you a new access token, right? And again, I've seen people hard coding the refresh token in property files, in config files. Okay, don't do that. These refresh tokens do expire, and anytime it expires, you have to go back to your property files and change that. So try not to do that unless you are 100% sure that, okay, it's probably never going to change, or even if it changes, it's probably 5 years down the line. Maybe then it's fine. But don't hard code it, or don't put it in config ideally. And as I said, it directly talks to the authorization server. So it doesn't need an UI. So it doesn't need an user to intervene. It's directly to the auth server and back. Okay. So as I said, for some cases like Google APIs, it probably doesn't expire. And again, things tend to change a lot when we are talking anything about security. So it probably doesn't expire today. Google might have a policy change tomorrow and it can start expiring. Okay. Now the next thing is, it always expires regardless of the service in most cases. Whenever you change your account password, or you add a multi-factor authentication, or you remove a multi-factor authentication, anything like that. So I've worked with Salesforce. You already know that whenever you do a change password, the token that you have used earlier for integration, that gets changed. It's similar to that. Anytime you do any kind of security settings changes in your account, most likely your refresh token will immediately expire, and you need to get a new one. Right. Okay. So one of the other example is Outreach APIs. Outreach is a sales enablement platform. In that case, they directly outrightly say in the documentation that our refresh token expires every 14 days. Now, what do? What is the recommended approach, right? So if it's a connector based configuration, probably the connector handles it internally. You don't have to do anything of that sort. But if you are doing it manually, what happens is, every time you request for a new access token, you don't only get an access token back, you also get a refresh token back as well. It can be the same one, it can be a new one. So anytime you are doing an authentication request, you get an access token back, you get a refresh token back. Store that new refresh token as well. Do not only store the access token, store the refresh token as well. Especially if you are dealing something like Outreach that outrightly says it always going to be reset in 14 days. Okay. And now, if it's a service like Google where the refresh token is pretty long lived, you'll get the same refresh token back. Now it doesn't hurt anything, but where it will save you is, in that case, the refresh token changes, right? So not only store the access token, store the refresh token as well, if you are handling it manually. In case of a connector config, that there's not much scope for you or I to do anything. It's the connector that handles it internally.
Arnab?
Yeah.
So can you please differentiate again between access token and refresh token? That was a question.
Okay. So an access token is what you need. Let's go to the previous slide. So an access token is the primary thing. Just think about it. Access token is the primary thing. That's the most important thing I need. Access token will give you access to a resource. Nothing else can. Not auth code, not refresh token. No other token can give you an access. Only access token can. Now, access tokens are short-lived tokens. So there are two types of tokens, right? There's a short-lived token, there's a long-lived token. Access tokens are usually short-lived. And refresh token is another token. It's not the access token. It's a separate token, using which you can get a new access token. And you should do that whenever your previous access token is near expiry. Technically, you can do it very frequently. As when Ashish started the session, right? He mentioned that if you get too many tokens from the auth server, it might throw you a 429 too many requests, right? So if your access token validation is for 1 hour, set a scheduler or something like that. If you're doing it manually, of course, not for the connected setup. If you're doing it manually, set a scheduler or something like that that refreshes that token just before 1 hour, maybe at 50 minutes or something. That's what is a refresh token. A refresh token can get you a new access token, but it cannot help you access any resource. Only an access token can do that.
Yeah, so I want to add, point here. Very simple terminology. Access token is used to access your resource. Okay, it can be your machine, it can be your API, it can be your system. Refresh token will be used when you're going back to the auth server. To connect auth server, your refresh token will be used. Your access token will be used to access the resource. Okay, so simple terminology. If your anypoint platform configure one auth server, right? When anypoint platform talks to your auth server, refresh token will be used to give the identity of that's what the Arnab mentioned, right? I am the guy who wants the new token. My token is expired. During that time, your auth server will ask, "Who are you?" Right? So that answer will be coming from your refresh token. Okay, so very simple. So refresh token will be used to connect your auth server. Your access token will be used to connect your resource. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks, Ashish.
Some questions in the chat as well. What is the min and max time period in access token? There's no min and max in general. It depends on the OAuth server. Google can implement it differently. Facebook can implement it differently. Okta can implement it differently. It all depends on your end system. Can you give brief idea about outreach APIs? It's a public system. There are public documentations available. You can just go ahead and do that. It follows a JSON API.org kind of convention. Uh, you can just publicly see that documentation. That's probably an out of scope for this particular session. Can we control the access token validity? No, you cannot. It depends on the auth server, as I said. Whatever the auth server says that an access token is for 1 hour, you do not have a way to configure that typically. What are the different types of access token and how they are different from each other? I don't know what that means. Maybe we can take it at a later point of time. I'll just continue with the session. But again, Abhay, I'll come back to this question because I'm not very sure I get that question properly.
So there is one question like, can you give brief idea about outreach APIs?
Yeah, as I said, right, outreach is just another end system. It has public APIs available, so it needs to be explored on for oneself. Right? It's not part of this particular session. This session is pretty generic on OAuth. We don't want to go inside any particular API and explain that. Okay.
Thanks, Anand.
Yeah. So coming to our first grant type, authorization code. Now, how that works and how you should configure it. Again, step one, user clicks a login link, right? And this is something that you provide in terms of MuleSoft. Okay, you have to provide it. What is that link or how do you provide that? We'll come to that part in demo. Now, your regular web app is what probably is your MuleSoft application. It requests to an /authorize endpoint, and it redirects you to a login prompt, right? And this part happens in browser, okay? And it's not in Postman or something. It's in browser. So step 1, 2, 3, 4, these are all in browser. So once that prompt comes, the user authenticates that. So what is a prompt? A prompt is when you log into your Gmail account, you see a box, right, that says, okay, log into this email, log into using your email and password. You click on login, and maybe when you are connecting to a third-party service, let's say, you want to connect to any website, maybe it's Medium, maybe it's your, it can be anything that uses a Google sign-on, right? So a consent screen is where it displays, okay, this particular app is requesting permissions from your Google account, and it displays the scopes, right? It says that, okay, this app can read your public info, this app can read your email address, this app can read your phone, this app can email on your behalf, whatever it is, whatever the scopes are. That particular screen where there's an allow button and a cancel button, that particular screen is the consent screen. That's what the authorized URL does. We'll see to that as well in the demo. Once you click allow, you get an authorization code back. Okay? You get an authorization code back. You don't get a token, you get a code back, right? Using that code, now you can get using that code, the client ID and client secret of that particular app. Now you can get an access token back, right? And now using that access token, you can access that particular resource, right? Now, when I use this, my first question looking at this flow was, why are there two steps? why can't I just retrieve the access token directly and get on with my life, right? Why are there a step of auth code and then again a step of access token? Why are there two different steps, right? So I'll explain that. Now, in terms of network terminologies, right? There's something called as a front channel and there's something called as a back channel. A front channel is perceived as less secure and a back channel is perceived as more secure. What are those? A front channel is typically your browser, any kind of website. A back channel is your backend server. That's CloudUp, that's EC2, that can be any server. So a back channel, it communicates with other servers, right? It's a server to server communication. That's pretty secure. It might be HTTPS or SSL encrypted. It can have different other encryption mechanisms, right? And that's happening in the backend. So that's back channel. That's considered to be very, very, very secure. Now, a front channel is browser. So assume that you need to get an access token. So to get an access token, what at least you need is a client ID and secret of your app, right? Now, if you put that client ID and secret in your web-based app, so that's JavaScript, HTML, right? If you put it there, anyone can visit your website, go ahead, click on inspect element and go to view source and see what are the client ID secrets you are using. If not that, they can at least go to the network tab of your browser and see what exact requests you are doing. They can get your client ID and secret. Even if you have that secured, what you cannot ever secure for any kind of browser-based apps is someone looking at your computer. So I'm typing a password, someone looks at my keyboard, someone looks at my screen, they can see whatever the secret I'm typing or whatever secret I'm using, right? That's why browsers are always considered to be very, very less secure. That's where this auth code flow comes in to help. So an auth code is not anything that's hidden. Auth code is very, very open. So to get an auth code, what you need is a redirect URL. I'll come to those details as well. You need is a redirect URL and only a client ID. To get an auth code, you do not need a client secret. You just need a redirect URL, your app name, scopes, and all, etc., etc. You don't need a client secret for that, because that part of an interaction is happening on a browser. So you get that auth code back, and when it gets back, you'll be able to see that auth code in your browser link, meaning it's not trying itself, to be something very, very secret or very, very secure. It's not trying to do that. Now, you grab that auth code. If you have a web-based app, it's your app's responsibility to send it back to MuleSoft. In that case, the redirect URL is your own app's URL. It's not related to MuleSoft. Or if it's a server-to-server authentication that's using auth code, it's your MuleSoft listener, wherein the query param, you get an auth code. Now, in that flow, you might think that, okay, why do I need an auth code and all that? Will come to that. But the auth code flow, the two-time ping pong, right? You get an auth code first and then you get an access token. These two steps were introduced, keeping in mind that these are browser-based things and it's not very secure to do any kind of client secret specific things from the browser itself. That was the initial intent. And that's why you need two kinds of different services. Now, what if you do not have a backend? But if you directly call Google APIs, right? You do not have a backend, so you do not have a secured way of storing a client secret, right? Ideally, that's not a recommended way to go at all. Your web app should always have a backend that deals with these kind of things, or you can call it a middleware, so that deals with these kind of things, right? Now, if it's not the case, and you specifically have a very strict single web page application, use implicit flow. And implicit flow is where you pass in the your client ID secret, your user consent, and everything, and you directly get an access token back. And that's why it's probably part of the legacy flow, because you should not be using that. You should not be doing that. Use auth code at least. It keeps your client secret secured. And when you do that client secret wala call, right, that the sixth step here, right, when you're sending that auth code, the client ID, the client secret, and that's the backend server doing it. That's the MuleSoft server doing it. When you do that, the authorization server checks all of those info, whether that auth code was issued to this particular client or not, whether this was issued to this particular redirect URL or not, whatever it is, it does all of those checks. And also it authenticates with that client secret. That way, the server can be 100% sure that, okay, it came from a secure channel and this is the client the auth code was issued to. And now here's your access token and refresh token. Now with that access and refresh token, of course, you can get access to your resource that you want to. And with that refresh token, again, you can get a new access token. Okay, I'll just wait. Balkis, do we have any questions?
No, Anna, we are good. Go ahead.
We're good. Okay. Okay, so this is why there are two steps in any auth code flow. Now, going back to refresh token, as we have already discussed quite a lot on refresh tokens, you just give the server the refresh token and it gives you a new access token back. As simple as that. With that access token, you can do your original API request. Now, this is what is interesting, a client credentials grant. Now, whenever you are integrating with a new end system, right, or you're starting your integration, this is what that is what I kind of believe what any kind of backend developer should believe is. This is what you should look for, whether that end system supports a client credentials grant or not. What is a client credentials grant? You give it a client ID and secret, it gives you directly an access token. How is it different from implicit that I already mentioned? And implicit needs an user consent. So it is a browser only flow. It has to be started from browser always. Client credentials is not, right? Client credentials is assumed to be a server side flow only. It's a machine to machine communication. You give it a client ID secret, you get an access token back. There's no refreshing concept here. Every time when you want to hit that particular endpoint, you get that access token. You maybe store it for 1 hour or something like that. Once that period is over, you get that access token again. Just directly the access token. There's no auth code. There's nothing else. And this does not need an UI at all. So anytime you're integrating using MuleSoft, any kind of end systems, right? The first thing you should be looking at is whether that system supports client credentials grant or not. If it does, it's mostly recommended to use that only. Do not go to the auth code flow because it at least needs once and a browser-based setup. It's not complete server to server. So again, I'll just wait for any Q&As regarding grant types on auth code, on refresh tokens, on access tokens, or client credentials grant or anything like that. Just a point to mention, it's not part of this PPT, but a client credential grant is basically it's tied to that app, right? So that's another advantage, that if that app has those scopes configured, it does not need to be dependent on a user. So when you think about auth code, right, the app is same. The client ID and client secret of that app is same, right? If I authorize this app, I can access only my resources that I am supposed to access, that I have access to. I can access only those resources because the access token that the server will get is tied to my auth code, and that's me as an user. So if I authenticate it, I get an access token that's tied to me. And if the resource that your server is trying to access, I directly don't have access to that, that access token can also not access that, right? Think of it as simple as, if there is a Google Sheet that I created, I did not share it with you. You ran an auth code flow, you got an access token, and you are trying to access that sheet. You won't be able to do that because that particular access token is tied to your user, and I'm not authorizing that. If I authorize it, that access token can get me that values of that particular Google Sheet. or Google contacts or whatever it is. In case of client credentials, you don't need a user. It's an app, it's a robot, it's a machine. So if anytime the developer leaves your organization or switches to a different branch or something like that happens, and he or she is not part of the project anymore, you don't need to worry about it in client credentials brand, because it's an app, it's a robot, it doesn't leave your organization unless you go ahead and explicitly delete that. That's a different story. But again, client credentials grant is not tied to an user, it's completely server based. So hence, whenever you are developing anything, first try to go with client credentials if that's available. Few APIs, or I'd say probably a lot of APIs, do not consider a server to server communication. They think about only web-based apps, and they only have auth code, right? So that's what you have to opt for if that server doesn't support it. But again, it completely depends. First check for client credentials, if not auth code. That's how the flow should be. Okay, I'll just wait for a minute for questions.
Yes, there are questions now. So yeah. So Shri Satya is asking her, can you show us the client credential grant again?
Again,
Okay,
okay.
what was there? Just can you show them again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So one more question is, can we implement OAuth with the help of security schemes in API specification?
You can, but again, it's not the implementation. It's just it's a spec. It's not implementation. You can just say that okay, this is how you need to authorize when you are trying to access this API. It's a specification. You can specify it. I've not tried it with RAML, but I know you have way of doing it in OpenAPI 3.0. Uh,
In RAML also we have option security
RAML also, yeah.
schemes.
Okay.
We can go direct. Yeah. And you can go in the type. You can say OAuth 2.0. There is
Mhm.
OAuth 1.0 also there.
Okay.
You can use it, and your API will be secured with OAuth 2.0. And then you need to follow this flow of getting token and passing that token to that particular API.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I've not tried with
Yeah.
RAML.
Yeah.
How secure is MuleSoft
Yeah. No. Go
providing?
ahead.
Can we recommend it to clients? It's
Yeah.
probably not part of this session. That's out of scope. This session is not on MuleSoft provider. That's a different thing. That's a separate session altogether. Okay.
Yeah, and you should not recommend it because you need to implement it. Okay, Mule Auth provider doesn't work just like that. Okay, we need to implement all the token URL, the validate URL. We need to implement it by ourselves. Okay, so don't take that risk of implementing it and again doing it. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But again, Ashish,
I
it's
think I
probably
think
not
that's
part
it.
of this session, right? Uh, yeah. It's a
Yeah.
discussion.
Good.
Okay. So okay. So I'll just go back directly to how do we configure it in Studio. I'll just run through this slide as well. I'll explain all of the configs that you need to do, and then we'll switch to Studio and see how that we have configured it that way, and we'll see how that works. Okay, now for the example of this particular presentation, now we know what is auth code, we know what is access token, we know what is refresh token, we know how that flow is supposed to work. Now we'll just and now this is where Studio comes into picture and the connectors come into picture, right? So and don't worry, I've kept the secrets and all in this slide as well. The secrets and client IDs are not valid anymore, so there's no risk in losing it, and they are also in trial accounts. So you can just try them, but make sure to replace with your own values, of course. So when you drag Google Sheets connector, right? I'll just take Google Sheets as an example. But again, as I said, any connector if you use, whether it's Slack, QuickBooks, JIRA, or any Microsoft connector, any Google connector, whatever it is. The concept is same and the configurations will look more or less the same. It can say client ID instead of consumer key, right? But that's understandable. The verbiage might be different, but what it's going to be doing at its root will be same. So I'll just take Google Sheets as an example here, and we'll explain that. What are the configurations there? So first of all, there are two things: access type and prompt, right? Access type offline, prompt consent. Now these are something very Google API specific. These are not needed or not compulsory for any other OAuth system. But why do we need it for Google? And this will be pre-populated when you drag that connector. Access type offline and prompt consent will be pre-populated there, right? Don't remove them. I'll come to what happens if you remove them. I'll come to that. Now, consumer key, consumer secret is just client ID and client secret of your app. So before you start, you need to create an OAuth app first, from where you will consider, where you will configure which scopes do you need that app to be, which APIs that app should access, or anything like that. Right? You can configure the consent screen. You can get that client ID secret, and it's different for every other end system. But it'll have a way to create an OAuth app. Once you have done that, in case of Google, you can do that in Google Cloud Console. It's pretty easy to do that. I'm just skipping that part. So, there are tons of articles and support articles there available how you can create an OAuth app. Once you do that, you get a client ID and client secret. That's what will stay in consumer key and consumer secret. Authorization URL, in case of these inbuilt connectors, these are pre-populated. That's something that you need not explicitly do. So authorization URL, typically it will end with /auth or /authorize. Or if you are configuring it yourself, there is a high possibility that your auth server will have a well-known URL. So just search for any service that you're using, let's say Okta. So just search for Okta well-known service, and you'll see what are the well-known URL for your particular app. It will be your instance specific. So assuming that you're working for ABC customer, so it will be abc.okta.com/.wellknown, like that. And in that well-known, if you hit that in browser, you will see what exactly is your authorization URL, your token URL, and a lot of other stuff as well. So, but for any default connectors that we have, these are all pre-populated. So authorization URL, that's where you get the auth code from. Access token URL, that's where you get the access token from. Scopes. Scopes is something that's where the granularity comes in, right? When I initially said that OAuth is for authorization, and authorization needs granularity. Maybe I want a service to access my contacts, but I don't want the service to delete my contacts or write any new contact. I just want it to be on a read-only access. That's where scopes come into picture. Whichever scope you give to that particular app, that those same scopes will be displayed to you when you are in the consent screen. And it will be in very simple terms. It will say that, okay, this app, this custom Mule app can write, read, edit, and delete your spreadsheets. It will be as simple as elaborative as that. If you're using a Facebook authentication, it also explicitly says whether that app can post on your wall on your behalf or not. That was a big user concern. Like, okay, I know this app can read my email, read my phone number, read my this, and I'm fine with that. But will this app also post spams on my behalf? This was a big user question, and that's why Facebook added an explicit line whether a particular app can explicitly post something on your wall on your behalf or not. And that's very and system specific. So you'll have an authorization URL, you'll have an access token URL, and you need to give space separated list of scopes, right? It might be as open as the first scope that's mentioned here, that's Google APIs, that /auth/spreadsheets. You can get those scopes when you configure the OAuth app as well. You'll see what are the scopes available. So this is the most open scope, and this gives you read, write, delete, and all the CRUD operation access. Now, these scopes here are not very real life like. In a real life, you should always use scopes that you absolutely need, like the one that's the next one that says auth/drive.read only. That's a read only scope. If you have an access token retrieved with that particular scope, uh, you cannot create a sheet. You cannot delete a sheet. If you access those APIs, it will just say that you don't have permissions for that, and it will probably return you a 4 zeros be forbidden for that. So these are scopes, and you should have it you should have very clear scopes on what you want to access. Don't have like an all scope kind of a thing, or a system admin scope kind of a thing that gives your app every access. That can be very, very risky in production environments. Okay, so once scope is out of the picture, in most cases it's space separated when you want multiple scopes, or in some cases it might be comma separated as well. Just check the connector documentation as well. Resource owner ID. Resource owner ID is you are a resource owner, so that's what the ID is for you. If it's a Mule app, which is probably going to be a single point of contact between the server and the resource you want to expose. Ideally, it will be a single string called default. If not, if you want your app to be multi-tenant, you can also configure this resource owner ID to take the value of client IDs. In this case, we are dealing with only a single client ID, single client secret, and a single app. So it takes a string called as default. Next is before and after. Before and after is like flow references, right? It takes in a flow name, and as the name suggests, it's like before this whole authorization happens, it will call that particular flow if it's configured in before, and it will call that particular flow after everything has happened if it's configured in the after tag. In typical cases, you probably don't need them, but again, if you want to perform some pre-steps pre to the authorization, you can configure that flow in before. Or if you want to do some post cleanup or whatever it is, you want to store it, you want to send it in a database or send it in a secured server, whatever it is you want to do with that token, or anything of that sort. So you can configure an after flow. We'll just keep it blank for now because we don't need that, at least for now. Now coming to callback path, I know there was a question initially regarding callback, and I hope this part will clear that for you. So what is a callback? A callback is a listener, as I said. If you are, I'm sorry, was saying something? Yes, no. Okay. So if you are configuring it yourself, right? If you are doing the whole OAuth flow yourself, you don't have a connector. In that case, you need to drag a listener, give it a path, and that becomes your redirect URL. And that's the same thing that needs to be configured everywhere in your Auth app and everywhere else. In case of connector configurations, you directly have an option to select your HTTP listener config, and you give it a /callback or / it can be anything, to be honest. It just by convention it's called callback. It can be anything, a callback or redirect URI, whatever it is. And keep in mind that this is a listener. You don't see it in your studio. You don't see it in your code. This config is a global config, so it will probably set that in your global.xml. But inside that, this listener exists. So, and this listener is specific for this kind of authorization to retrieve your auth code, basically. But you don't see this explicitly in your implementation or interface.xml file. It's a listener that stays in background. Same way with the authorized as well. External callback URL in most cases is optional, and when you need it is the complete string, the complete redirect URL. So earlier in listener config, it has a config and then a callback path, but in external callback URL, you can give the whole part of it. Now, where you need it or why you need it. Essentially, it's optional. So if it's optional, you don't need to give that. Where do you need it is in a lot of services when you are especially working with localhost, right? When the redirect happens, when you receive that auth code, in a lot of services. Let's say I believe JIRA does this, the JIRA connector and JIRA APIs. QuickBooks does this, QuickBook APIs. What they do is they translate callback or my bad, sorry, not callback, localhost to its own IP. That's 127.0.0.1. So when you receive that code, you get 127.0.0.1. And keeping in mind, when you receive an auth code, if it's on URL X, when you request an access token, that X URL should also be supplied. And it should exactly match with X. If that doesn't, it will throw you an error saying that, okay, this auth code does not belong to you. You did not get that. And when this thing happens, right, when it translates localhost to 127.0.0.1, or maybe it's adding a port as 443 or 80, whatever it is, right? It's probably going to be 443 because they all work via CDPS only, unless it's localhost. So it's going to throw you a redirect URI mismatch error. In that case, you might want to fix this external callback URL, this whole callback URL, including localhost 8081 callback, and this will keep or this will retain that URL. This does not let your browser or Mule server or whatever medium you have to change that to its following IP. It will keep that URL, and when it does the I mean it by keeping the URL, I mean like JIRA will of course translate it to 127.0.0.1, but when that access token request happens, the connector will use this URL only. It won't use 127.0.0.1. It will use whatever this complete URL. Again, all of the values are hard coded just for reference. You should have all of them from property files, regular and secure properties as applicable. That's where you need external callback URL. Object store. This is where your refresh and access token will be stored, right? Ideally, if you're doing this kind of flows, you do not want your token to expire, right? And anything that you store in object store, there's a default ETL of 30 days, right? So I'd suggest have a custom object store, have a custom object store config, like a custom partition of it, and configure that, and keep the expiration interval as 0. And if you go to the object store documentation, you would see that if an expiration interval is set to 0 or negative, the expiration thread does not run. So whatever the value is on TTL, that's not valid anymore. So that token lives forever. It does not auto expire from an object store point of view, right? So I'll just suggest whenever you are doing this kind of a setup, keep keep a specific object store like token store or whatever it is. Set the expiration interval to 0 or negative, so that it doesn't expire from an object store point of view. Okay, so now let's get back to Studio once. I'll show that this is the same things that has been configured. Okay, it's again not letting me share my screen. Let me see if it lets me share screen one. Some reason.
You're not facing an issue.
Sorry.
Okay. You're facing an issue to share the screen, Nanda?
No, it's not letting me share my screen. It's just saying there was a problem sharing a screen. Try using any other browser or rejoin. I don't know why.
Okay, let me turn off your phone. Okay.
Make him a host again.
Yeah, I will. Can you try now, Anna?
Yep. Nope. Saying the same thing. So how do I share it? It's not letting me share my entire screen. It's not letting me share a window.
Now you are a host. Can you try now? It should
Still
now.
not access. It's not letting me. Don't know. Just give me 1 minute, then I'll rejoin from a different browser.
Okay,
Yeah.
no problem. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please go ahead and post in the chat. Anybody wants to add anything?
Okay, let me try now. Hmm. Is my screen visible?
Yeah.
I can hear my own voice. So let me fix this. Mhm.
Are you able to share, Arnav?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying. It's my screen visible, but for some reason I can hear my own audio.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay. Is my audio echoing?
No,
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 no, no.
it's
It's
clear.
good for us.
Okay, it's echoing for me. Okay. Just go back to. Is my studio visible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Meanwhile, there are two questions, Arnav. If you can
Sure.
take those.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what things we should focus mainly while implementing the OAuth as a MuleSoft developer?
Um, so the first thing that you need to check is whether there's a client credentials grant available or not. If yes, use that because it's going to be a server-to-server communication, right? That's the first thing you need to check. Next is uh, even if your service does not support client credentials grant and you are doing auth code rate of it, um, you need to make sure that it's not tied to a particular user. So when you click on that authorized button, uh, have your customer or client or whoever is the owner of the IT team or ops team, let them create a separate account
Arnav?
that's not meant for a personal
Your
use,
voice is not clear now.
Yeah, Arnav, there are some hiccups in your voice.
right? Okay.
Not
Uh,
clear.
I don't know what to do or how to solve it. Okay. I don't know what's happening. Maybe my voice is clear in this browser, but in this browser, it's not letting me share screen.
Okay.
Then how can I do it?
Uh,
Maybe you can
you
continue
can
with your
log in.
presentation.
I can, sorry.
You can continue with your presentation.
Okay.
Are you
Okay.
done with that?
No, I'm not. I was trying to show it in this one. Okay, let me try the last browser.
Maybe you can log in twice. Okay.
Yeah, with the two browser you can log in, and with that you can share the screen, and in the other one you can use
Um,
as a mic.
so that's what happens, right? When I log into this browser, it logs me out of the other one.
Oh.
Okay, just give me 1 second. I'm just trying my last browser.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Chrome, Edge, Safari, none of them is allowing me to share screen. Don't know why. Okay, I'll just then continue with the presentation. It has all of it, but again, it better share studio. Okay, I'll just continue with what I have.
Okay.
So all three browsers, they are not letting me share screen at all.
Okay, no problem. It happens.
Yeah, I can share when I go to an Edge tab or a Chrome tab, it lets me share a particular tab, but it doesn't let me allow share a screen, any screen. I don't know why. Okay. Okay, so let's just continue. Let's not waste time. Were there any questions that you
Yeah.
addressed?
So you are in that question like what things we should focus mainly while implementing the OAuth as a MuleSoft developer.
Okay, yeah. So again, so client credentials, first check for that. If not, check auth code. If you're doing auth code, make sure that's not tied to an user. That's what I would say. Anything else is just what your system supports or your authorization server supports or whatever is your client's security recommendations. Everything else depends on that. But as a developer, first check for the grant type, and then check for it should be user independent as much as possible. And at the least, use scopes and try to use the least the scope with the least amount of access that you absolutely need. Right. Okay. So that's out of the way. So okay, so that means I cannot share Postman, I cannot share anything. This doesn't let me share Postman as well. I don't know why this is the first time it's happening. Okay, I'll just continue. uh, just a second. Hopefully it lets me share this tab. Okay. Yeah, it just lets me share Chrome tabs or Edge tabs only. It doesn't let me share anything outside of that. I don't know why. I believe I have the right security settings. I don't know why. Okay, I'll just continue with what I have. So again, in Studio, there's nothing much different from this. It's just a global config connector, which has all these things configured. It would have been great to show you the demo, and I had debug logs in the studio as well to see how that ping pong is actually happening, but probably we can't do that. I'll try to add a link somewhere if it allows me to for that particular build, so that you can try it out yourself.
Sure.
Arnab, can you go a little bit full screen?
Um, this is what it's doing. So, is it still small or is it good now?
Yeah. Oh,
Good
Still
or is
same.
it again small?
the full screen is going in small. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So I'll
Okay.
just keep it this way then.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yes, you will be. Okay. Um. This is visible, right? I'll just.
Yes, yes, this is better than.
Okay. Now, this particular slide, right now, the connector config. You don't need to do anything else. You just hit request access app. Okay, I can share a Chrome tab, right? So I'll probably share the consent screen as well. That I'll do. Before that, and uh, as I said, right, when it's a connector config, the connector takes care of refreshing your token and storing your token, storing the refresh token and whatever it is. It takes care of that. You don't need to do anything explicitly other than that authorization. That starts from the browser. There's a content. There's a consent window. Click on allow. Done. Now, what happens if you do not have that freedom, right? If you do not have a connector available for your end system and you want to connect it via regular APIs, regular HTTP requests, right? So that's what we'll cover here. So first of all, what you'll see whenever you use the HTTP request connector, right? Let's see. Okay, so better zoom. Whenever you use HTTP request connector, right? You'll always see in the HTTP request config that's the global config. If you are in general tab, you'll see an option called authentication, uh, and under which it only accepts four types of authentication. It can be none, of course, or it can be an expression. It can be basic auth, it can be digest, or it can be NTLM. Right? There's no way to do OAuth here right now. I need to implement an auth code flow or a client credentials grant flow. How do I do that? There's no option here. Now, in order to do that, what you need to do is you need to add the OAuth module, the dependency in your project. So just go ahead. It would have been great to show you, but go to Studio, click on plus add module, and there will be an OAuth module as well. Drag and drop to your own project or add it in pom.xml directly. That's what will add some options to your request connector itself, which are these ones. Once you have that OAuth module installed, right, you will see the same HTTP request config will now have, yeah, the same request config will now have these kind of values, which are the expression basic auth IDS and TLM was already there, but it has added two particular options: auth code grant, grant credentials grant. Inside HTTP request connector itself, you need not do anything else. Just add the OAuth dependency. these options will be visible as soon as you do that. Okay. Now coming to how do you configure it in the HTTP request itself. So for example, I won't go through the same things that uh, you already have seen in the connectors. I'll just add whatever is extra, right? So most of the configs are similar to what there were already. Now there's another additional config that you'll see that's called a state. Maybe I'll just zoom into this particular part and we'll explain that. So once you select authorization code grant, you'll see an option to give that local callback config path, right? That's anything / callback, but as I had these two both connectors in the same project itself, in the same Mule project itself, of course. So I configured it to different listener paths. So you just give it a path / callback / redirect, whatever it is. You configure that same your local config or your listener config. So that once that's done, the external callback URL, that's the same as what we saw in the connector. Now state is a pretty important parameter for any web developer mostly. It can be used in MuleSoft applications as well. What is state? So think about it. Whenever there's a website, it's in state A, or state is a page. It's a page. It's in a web page. It goes back to the auth server and comes back. Right? When it comes back to the redirect URL. It doesn't come back to the page you were already there. It comes back to your redirect URL. Now think about it. When you browse the internet, right, you do not always click on login from the home page unless you know what you are already doing. It'll probably maybe assume that you want to buy a product. Let's say you want to buy Postman, right? You'll probably go to Postman's website. You'll see the licenses. You'll see the prices. You'll see what are the options it has, any competitive advantage, how it can help your business. And maybe when you want to click on buy, or maybe you want to click on get a quote or whatever it is, it asks you to log in, right? Now you click on login. You logged in with your Google account credentials or whatever it is. And when it came back, it came back to the home page. Now you as a user, you don't know where you left off, and you need to again go back to that particular page. You need to remember where you were there last time, and then go back to there. Okay? Now that kind of hurts the user experience real bad. That's a typical use case of state. What state does is it accepts any string. It accepts any kind of string. It takes that string, and when the authorization code comes, it includes that same string with the request as well. So as a web app developer, you know when the request came in, right? When it went to the auth server and came back, you know where the user was in the last state, right? Now that's a typical use case. Not saying that that's the only use case. You can use it for multiple reasons. In the MuleSoft world, where I have used state is whenever you want your Mule app to be multi-tenant. So when someone authorizes your app, my requirement was I need to know which client is authorizing that app. Okay, so for example, if there are 10 different Salesforce instances, I need to know where that authorization server or token is coming in. So what I did was when I hand over the authorization URL for them, for the customer to give the consent, I add a state as well. And a state can be anything that uniquely identifies that client or user. So whenever they authorize and they give the consent and it comes back to me as in a MuleSoft listener, I can see which state or for my case, which client identifier that it has. That way, without looking at the authorization token or the auth code or anything like that, I know that this auth code came from this particular instance. That's a custom requirement that I had, but again, that's where state comes handy. Now, your local authorization URL will be something like /authorize or anything that you configure. Other than that, your actual authorization URL will be OAuth2/auth. Now, what's the difference between a localhost authorize and an auth URL? I'll come to that, and that happens in browser, so probably I'll be able to show that. So I'll come to that as well. Now, how do I zoom out? I want to zoom in specifically here. Okay. So now, if you remember, there were two things called as prompt consent and access type offline when we configure the Google Sheets connector, right? That's the same thing that we need to send it this way as well. So I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm invoking the same Sheets API as well. So I need to send these two fields. These are any custom parameters or any custom attributes that your auth server needs. Why do we need these two parameters? What happens if you don't give them? So when you get the auth code, you request for an access token, you get an access and a refresh token, right? Unless you supply these two parameters for Google APIs, which is prompt consent and access type offline, it won't give you a refresh token. It will just give you an access token. What that means is it's basically it basically would work like a secured implicit flow. So every time you want to use that integration, someone has to go to that browser and authenticate. Then only you get an access token. Then only you can access on the source. You cannot store anything. You cannot refresh that token. After 1 hour, that access token is expired. You cannot refresh it. You don't have a refresh token. So make sure if you are specifically configuring Google API, these two parameters are really, really important. Resource owner ID, again, default, encode client credentials embodied, whatever is just default, just keep it that way. Client ID secret, as we had earlier from consumer key, consumer secret. Scopes, again, the same thing, the same concept. Object store, again, same concept, have a custom store. Then let me just this, and yeah, I think that's all the configurations we had. Yeah, at the last, it just takes you the token URL. Earlier we provided the authorized URL. This is the token URL. And below that, there will be three options that would have been great to show it in Studio, but this will be anyways pre-populated as well. These will say you can give it as custom parameters, which exact part in the response holds which token. For example, when that access token comes to you, your payload that access token has the access token. Your payload dot refresh underscore token has the refresh token. Like these are assumed things, but as I said, your OAuth server might implement it differently. So these can be configured when you are doing it the custom way. Now Google will always send it this way. That's why in a end system specific connector you don't have these options. Since there is a HTTP request, it's generic, so you'll have you can select where your access or refresh token is. So again, that's the same thing that's explained on the left side of it. But yeah, it would have been great to show them. But okay, I'll just show what I can show from browser. So my project is already deployed. I'll just stop sharing this tab and I'll share another tab. Okay, let's me share a tab. Okay, it probably doesn't show the URL that I'm typing in the browser, but I'll put that in chat just in case. So it's an URL something like this. So I'm giving it an URL over which is of my Mule application's URL. So that's what I'm typing in browser. And once I hit enter, it redirects me to the actual Google authorized link. Right? I'll paste that in chat as well. Just so that as soon as you click this in browser, it will automatically redirect you to the Google auth server, and that looks something like this. Okay. So you will be able to see that it's a google.com URL. It will have the client ID. It will have the response type selected as code. Again, it doesn't do with secrets. It's just a client ID. It will have the redirect URI as well. Now here you can authorize, and this is the consent screen, right? And so here you can authorize with which account or whatever it is you want to get access to. So once I'll authorize with my account, and it will give you all of the information. And where does this populate from? This comes from the scopes you have configured. So what I have configured is an complete drive scope, a complete drive property scope, and a edit, create, delete spreadsheet scope. So now, yeah, and also you can click on here and see who is the developer and where it will redirect you. Uh, Once you know, make sure that okay, these scopes are good with you. You just click on allow, and what you will see in browser in case of successful access token retrieval as well is this: successfully retrieved access token. After this, you can just close this tab. You don't need to do anything. So the token is stored inside the connector, and it's basically authenticated now. Now you go ahead and invoke your actual operation. Maybe you want to get details of a particular sheet or whatever is whatever the resource you actually want to access. That's after this. And if you invoke your first flow or your actual API before doing this kind of things, you'll see an error saying OAuth dance not yet performed. Uh, the thing that we did right now with authorized URL and getting the token and all, this is the OAuth dance. If you have not done this, and again, this is all environment specific, right? It stores in access token, it stores in object store. If you have performed it in local, and of course, when you deploy it to Cloud Hub or your on-prem environment, you need to run this flow again. You need to make sure the redirect URL is configured specifically for that environment. So that's done. And the same way, when you are doing it for the HTTP request flow, same URL, same flow, same successfully retrieved access token. The same thing will happen. So that's why I'm not repeating it again. I have a few FAQs to cover for OAuth flows. So the same thing will happen, and that's where. So what is OAuth dance and why we are using? Okay, so this is what is OAuth dance. So when you go to the auth server, get an auth code, again go to the auth server, get an access token. This is OAuth dance, and I'll come to that as part of FAQ as well. So once this is done, again, this is a pre-step for before your actual API calls. This has to be completed first. So I'll stop sharing this screen and I'll just go back to our PPT. Would have been great to share it in Studio, but okay. So these same exact flows, I just have had it configured in two different ways. It was getting the same APIs. So I'll probably hit the API in Postman and then I'll just give a curl of that on curl and a response on how that would look like. So for example, I want to what the API that I have implemented in Studio that I'm gonna show unfortunately is it retrieves the content of a sheet. Okay, so my curl would look like something like this. So what I do is I just have an endpoint called /list, and I take a query parameter ID where it takes in a Google Sheet ID, and the response would look something. It will give you a range of the major dimensions and the values in terms of arrays. And this response and this API calls and everything is same with connector and without connector as well. So I've kept it completely similar. I can show the difference. So
I think Arnab, we are not sharing the right screen, I guess.
No, I cannot write.
Okay.
I cannot.
Okay.
That's why I put them in chat.
Okay. Okay. Fine.
It's not letting me. Okay. So we covered this with OAuth module. How does it look with OAuth? So yeah, I'll just conclude with some FAQs. So these are some of the I'd say common errors or common things to consider as developers or architects. So can we do a custom zoom?
So is it for everyone? I mean, the screen is hang. Your screen is hang. It's not moving at all. I could see that HTTP
Yeah,
request
I
config. Oh,
Okay.
stop the sharing.
yeah, that's the reason you said, right? This. Then it was not moving at all. That's the reason I said.
Oh, okay. Sorry for that. Okay. I believe the FAQ screen is now visible, right? Can you see it?
Yes.
Balkis, Ashish?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not say anything that's in slide as well. So this was the last slide. So FAQs. So we'll go ahead to some of the things that you might see when you're dealing with OAuth. So first of all, this is an error which says OAuth authorization dance not yet performed for resource owner ID default. That's the same thing which I mentioned, that you have not authorized your app and you are directly trying to access the resource. It doesn't have an access token. So that's what your connector will throw, that this dance, right, this authorization has not yet been performed. Once you see successfully retrieved access token in browser, uh, then you go ahead and hit your actual endpoint. You won't see this error then. It can be on a different lines where it says resource owner ID null. It doesn't say default, it just says null. This means there are two things to be fixed. One is you do not have a resource owner ID set. It has to be set to default or client ID, uh, and also that you have not performed the auth grants, both of these. 401 unauthorized and 403 forbidden, not part of any OAuth discussion, but it's a bigger REST API kind of a thing. How you interpret these two and what are the differences between these two. Um, for example, as an employee of XYZ Corp, Mark is 401 to enter Epicero premises. That means he's not authorized to enter Epicero's premises, but as an intern of Epicero, uh, some other employee is 403 to enter a leadership conference room, but not the whole premises. That's just very simple example of how authorization and authentication is different. Authentication is show me who you are, and authorization is, okay, I know who you are, but you are not allowed to access this particular thing. So okay, now based on when you are configuring OAuth, based on which kind of error you are getting, you need to debug that. If you are getting 401 authorized, that means you are not authorized to do it at all. It doesn't allow it to do anything with that particular resource. Um, so you need to make sure that your URLs are correct. You are sending a header as content type xww form URL encoded. That's again typical case. Most of the authorization servers, they accept these parameters as form URL encoded only. And the redirect URL that you have configured is same in the OAuth app, in your MuleSoft listener, and in browser. It should be same everywhere. But if you are getting a 403 forbidden, it's probably that you need to first check your scopes. Forbidden is, okay, you are a legit user, but you do not have access to this particular thing. So you might need to check your scopes. The object store part, the entry DTL and the expiration interval, this I believe I've already discussed about. Set your expiration interval to 0 or negative so that the expiration thread does not run. So any entry DTL value is ignored in that case. So your tokens that's stored in object store will never expire in terms of object store, not in terms of the auth server. And make your object store persistent as well if you want to deploy it on Cloud Hub and make it persistent. Um, Now, auth or API key. So there's a very I won't say very common, but typically a lot of end systems support multiple authentication or authorization ways of doing it. So in some cases, there are systems that say, okay, you can do it using OAuth and you can do it using API key as well. Now, which one should you opt for, right? Again, this is my personal opinion. So first, an API key typically in a lot of cases are sent over query params. Again, a big red flag. Whereas the authorization server or the JIRA tokens or whatever you have is sent over headers. Any this kind of secret information should be sent over headers and not params. You can restrict OAuth by particular scopes, by particular granular scopes. API key is not that much. Auth uses dynamic tokens, so it's very even if someone gets hold of a token, a particular access token, it will expire after some point of time, so it will be invalid. Whereas in API key is a static string, it's as good as checking, okay, this string is equal to this string, okay, give it access. The tokens, the auth tokens, they expire automatically, and an API key usually have a manually rotate secret option, but again that's a manual rotation in case you want to change it. Now this the last line is something that I've taken from one of the documentations that I've read on this topic, that says API keys are good for rapid prototyping when you just want to check what is the request and response just in terms of development. But anything that's on production or pre-production or needs to be commercial or it needs to be very, very secure, you should implement or you should use enterprise level OAuth protocols only and not API keys. Next is whether you should use auth code grant or client credentials. Client credentials any day for server-side apps like MuleSoft. If it's not available, then check for auth code. Security on callback URL. Now, this is something that has come to me as a question from one of the security teams, where they said that, okay, you have this MuleSoft APIs, all of our endpoints are secured, but this callback URL, this is a listener. This can be hit, like we are hitting it from browser. That does not mean that it cannot be hit from Postman. I can still invoke it. It won't work, but I can still invoke it. So how do you secure that? That's what the question from the customer was. Because you cannot put client ID enforcement or any kind of security on a callback URL. Else your auth server won't be able to invoke it at all. Right? So it won't reach inside your MuleSoft application. So one of the, I do not have a concrete answer for this particular use case, for this particular question. One of the workarounds that we did was we used to stop that flow. So it was a custom integration. There was no connector available. So whichever flow does that authorization work, as soon as that authorization is over, we just used to stop that flow using Groovy script. Again, that's a real workaround. I don't know if it will be available in any kind of future versions or something. But it's something I thought I should share with the community because it has come as a question from the security experts. If you are doing it from for a connector specific way, what you can do is you can have a separate flow, maybe a false flow or whatever it is, configure it in before in config and stop that flow. So anything that needs to happen before that, it's stopped, so your whole flow doesn't work anymore. Again, these are just workarounds. These are not any concrete solutions. You can have a better one, and you can have a much concrete one. This is just a workaround. Client credentials user dependent. Now, client credentials are usually or typically or in 99% of cases are not user dependent. Now, one of the and that's why it's easier to manage, and it's not some employee left the organization and the integration is stopped. It's not that way. But some or I would say the only case that I've seen that breaches this is one of the system called Seismic. Seismic is a content management platform, more of a CMS. So Seismic has its own APIs, and it supports client credentials grant, whereas their implementation of it says it has to be tied to a user, which defeats the whole purpose of it. But it is how it is, and it is how the seismic developers thought it should be. So make sure that it's not that way. In that case, you can just go with auth code, right? It doesn't harm anything. Anyways, it's user dependent. It's not user independent. But typically, in most cases, client credentials will not be tied to any user. It's an app, it's a robot, it's machine to machine. The one of the last things, auth connector config does not match with this PPT. Now, whatever is shown in this PPT, again, as I said, OAuth is a particular standard or protocol. How you implement OAuth is dependent on the system you are working with. Google can have it differently, Okta can have it differently, right? So if the concept at its core will remain same, but as I said, like for example, this is Seismic API in client credentials grant, they need also an user ID to tie it with an user. That's their own implementation. So if you are dealing with any particular end system, make sure to read the complete documentation and see how their OAuth flow works. The concepts will remain same. The implementation can be different. And the last thing, it's very very basic. So I've seen in some of the projects that users that just needs to do a very simple thing. That's like, whenever there is an error, instead of sending a mail, publish a notification to Teams or Slack or whatever like this, right? In that case, I've seen people configuring the whole OAuth flow, using the whole connector and all. I would say in that case, again, this is again a personal opinion or a personal suggestion, that if you have that kind of a very very small use case, right, you might not need to do all of these hassles, all of these bot dances, apps configuration and maintenance and everything else. Use a webhook instead. In that particular case, it's a lot less effort. It's easily changeable via property configs and everything. And to me, it kind of looks like an overkill. But again, it's completely dependent on your use case. If your use case needs it, you have to use that. If not, if it's as simple as this error notification, I'll just say just use a simple webhook. So yeah, I'll just stop here for any questions.
There is a question like, in which layer of API-led connectivity will be implement OAuth?
Now again, it's a kind of a debatable topic, right? So the thing is, you need to expose it. So by that way, it kind of has to be an experience, but it needs to connect with the end system as well. By that way, it should be end system as well. So you need to decide based on your use case. If I have to save on what I have done in the past is, since it does not directly connect with the end system, right? This token retrieval is with the OAuth server. That's different from the end system. So typically, I've kept it in experience as well. I do all of these things in experience and then pass that as an additional header in the following layers. But again, it depends. It would depend on your architecture how you want to define that.
Okay. So any resource links you have to try this hands-on?
Any resource links to try this hands-on? Can we share any kind of jars or anything? Because is that possible?
In LinkedIn, it is possible to share.
Yeah, so that's what I'll probably put a build of this in Google Drive or something, and I'll share that link.
Yeah. Thanks, Anand. So I think we are good now. So can we start the quiz?
Yes, over to you then.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so Balkis, I'll stop the recording now, okay?
Okay.